The Onion, the satire site that uses the form of a newspaper for humor, that came out last year that really resonated with me. And the headline was, "Report. Today, the day they find out you're a fraud." The first sentence read, "While experts agree, you've been remarkably successful so far at keeping up the ruse that you're a capable, worthwhile individual. A new report out this week indicates that today is the day they finally figure out you're a complete and utter fraud." I laughed when I read this because The Onion had done it again. They had written a totally unfactual story that nonetheless rang very true to human experience. And I laughed because I realized that meant I wasn't alone in that experience. That experience of feeling like I was about to be found out of the fraud I really was. If people at The Onion were writing about it, then lots of other people must have that experience. It reminded me, reading that article, of my experience doing hospital chaplaincy for one summer. As part of the preparation for becoming a fellowshipped Unitarian Universalist minister, candidates are required to do a unit of a program called Clinical Pastoral Education. And this program is usually done in hospitals, but it can be done in other institutions. And it's a short-term, intensive learning experience where you learn by doing, and then by reflecting on what happened, and then by trying again. It was one of the most challenging and rewarding things I've ever done in my life. I went back home to my hometown called Normal, Illinois, believe it or not, to do this program over the summer after my first year in seminary in New York City. Most of these chaplaincy programs don't pay. In fact, you have to pay them tuition. So I definitely wasn't going to be paying New York City rent. So I had to go back and stay with my parents. And I remember so clearly the first time my pager went off when I was the on-call overnight chaplain. We'd had our few days of orientation, shadowing the professional chaplains. We'd been making the rounds on our assigned floors of the hospital during the day and processing those experiences with our peers and our supervisor. But this was my first overnight. This was the first time that I was the only chaplain in the hospital, the one who would be called on if something were to happen, if someone asked for me, if someone was dying. And I felt really inadequate as I got out of bed in the chaplain office and answered the page. Because here I was 24 years old, I was living with my parents, I was 1 year into seminary, and only a couple of weeks into this program. And as I changed into my professional clothing and set off for the ER, I knew I was not equal to the task at hand. And not only that, but also, what could you really do to make a difference anyway? If someone was losing a loved one, what could you really do? And I find that these are two of the biggest stumbling blocks I come up against in my life and my work. I'm not good enough, and there's nothing that can really be done anyway. As it turns out, that night, my first call was actually really easy. It was more or less a false alarm, a situation that could have been serious, but wasn't actually serious, and nobody died or got a difficult diagnosis. I wasn't very necessary. But there were other times that summer when it did matter that I showed up. Me, my inadequate and not so skilled self, in situations that were really terrible. And I never fixed anything. I definitely never saved anybody. But I empathized, I sat with them, prayed, and people were a little less alone, a little less afraid of their own feelings, a little more ready to face what was actually happening. I think it's pretty easy to find ourselves in situations where we're either in over our head or where our actions just feel like a drop in a bucket. And I have a suspicion that some of you might know what I'm talking about. You ever felt like that, inadequate to a task, or like the task was so huge it didn't really matter if you did anything at all? Yeah, I see some nods. I feel this way a lot, actually, during my current work. I'm supposed to be supporting young adult ministries all over the country, as Art mentioned, at the Unitarian Universalist Association, and I'm supposed to be supporting campus ministries on college and university campuses all over the country. And I'm part of a team that's building a support system for all kinds of emerging ministries, new kinds of ministries, and new congregations all over the country. So, I feel pretty inadequate. And I feel like even if we did do something really huge, like add 10 new campus ministries, we would still have UU campus ministries at less than 1% of the colleges and universities in the country. So it feels like a drop in the bucket. So I act as if. I have some actual advice to give constituents when they call me about starting a new campus ministry or trying to enhance their young adult ministry. And I act as if it matters that someone sets up a new group that reaches maybe 10 people. And then, the funny thing is, when I act as if that's true, I find out I actually do have advice. And I actually was editing our outdated campus ministry handbook this week, and once I got editing it, I basically just rewrote the whole thing because I had so many resources to share. And it actually really does matter that somebody sets up a group that serves 10 people. It matters a lot to the student who is really nervous to leave the safety and support of their UU youth group back home. And it matters a lot to the student who has never heard of Unitarian Universalism and is just transformed by finding out there's a faith where they can be open and be themselves. So, I imagine you may have learned these lessons too, in your personal life, in your work, whether paid or unpaid work. You may have found from time to time that you were up to more of a challenge than you knew, or that your little drop in the bucket made a big difference. And I think it's one of those lessons that we learn over and over because it's so easy to forget, and it's so easy to get back in that place of inadequacy and overwhelm. And the thing is, as Unitarian Universalists, we are called over and over to act as if. We are a covenanted people, a people who make sacred agreements about how we will be in community and how we're going to be in the world. We're a people of faithful action. And while every congregation has their own covenant, there's also a covenant that we have for all the member congregations all together, and it's a pretty high bar. I know at this congregation we've been exploring those principles that we agreed to, one by one. And we covenant to affirm and promote them, all seven. But they're really nothing to sneeze at. When I was here the week before Easter, I remember it was the goal of world community with peace and liberty and justice for all. That was the principle we were exploring. And I was thinking, what? Are you kidding me? Like, I'm going to bring peace and liberty and justice to the whole world, and also that's never going to happen. Have you even seen the news? Except, I promised. As a Unitarian Universalist, I promised to promote that principle. I promised to act as if such a thing were possible. As if every person has inherent worth and dignity, even when their behavior is mad at me. That's our first principle. As if equity and compassion are realistic expectations in our flawed human relationships. Second principle. And as if the democratic process is worthwhile even when it's totally rigged, like it is in our larger society. That's our fifth principle. And it's really hard. It's really hard living into these promises. And I started to notice that when I was growing up UU. I grew up in a kind of a small, humanist-leaning congregation in central Illinois. It was a refuge for for liberals in a politically red and corn and soybean filled county. There were lots and lots of churches in our town, but the vast majority of them were fundamentalist and conservative-leaning Christian churches, and there weren't many options for anybody who didn't fit that particular mold. So we were pretty concerned with maintaining our safe haven and our refuge. So because of that, there was a lot of emphasis on keeping things rational, leaving God and certainly leaving sin right out of it. And so I learned there, I started to internalize this message that if we're going to believe something, it had better be logical and reasonable and grounded in evidence and something you could argue. Now, I love that church, and I really love those people who religiously raised me. They taught me about all of the world's religions. They provided a loving community and a model for what it looks like when we come together and support each other. I got to sing my heart out in youth choir, and I learned in the About Your Sexuality curriculum, which was the precursor to the Our Whole Lives that we have now. I learned a lot in that class, and it set me on a course to become a peer educator and hotline respondent at my local Planned Parenthood in high school. So all in all, they made a huge impact on me. And at the same time, I came to realize that I need a little more faith in my Unitarian Universalism than what I got at that particular congregation. Because one thing about having the really rational, logical, evidence-based beliefs is that there isn't that much room to act as if. There isn't a lot of room for pretending, or for faking it, or for trusting something beyond yourself, or for hoping in the face of hopelessness. If you've got to stick to the facts, it can be hard to get past those realities of, I'm not good enough for this, and it doesn't matter. Now, Unitarian Universalism, we draw on a lot of different sources, 6 sources actually, in our faith tradition. And these 6 sources counsel us to heed different kinds of wisdom. And that's something I really appreciate about our faith. And now one of these is the humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against the idolatries of the mind and spirit. And that's really crucial, because idolatries of the mind and spirit wreak a lot of havoc on our society, I've come to notice. And we have other sources. We have the direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. So, for me, that's the source that really helps me when I need to act as if. When I face a situation where I feel inadequate, where things seem hopeless, what I do is I pray. And I connect to that transcending mystery, and I place my trust not in my limited skills, not in my ability to make a difference, but in the knowledge that there is a force in this universe that is creative and is so much stronger than all the things that are wrong, and is so much bigger than me. And when I connect that way, I have the courage to act as if I were adequate and as if my actions mattered, and then they usually do. And that was how I coped with doing my pastoral education in that chaplaincy situation, was that I would pray, and that would help me be able to actually go ahead and go in that hospital room where I knew I couldn't save anybody, where I knew I didn't have very many skills. But I don't think prayer is the answer for everybody. I really don't think that. It works for me, but it doesn't work for everybody. But I do think there's a lot of different ways we can connect with that source, that transcending experience. You know, I think some people can look up at the night sky and see the universe. And that amazement, that sense of just how profoundly amazing all of creation is, can carry you through those doubts. And I think that other folks really lean into our human relationships, where we also, I think, experience that transcendent mystery. And when we find that someone else loves and trusts us, even when we don't love and trust ourselves, that can give us what we need to keep going. ways we can get to that direct experience. And however it is, I think we can draw on it when we're in those situations where we have to live into our promises that are really hard. Because really, I think it's good to be realistic. We are only human. We are flawed. Our egos get in the way, and we don't have all the skills that we need. We're really just not superheroes. And I think it's good to be realistic about the world, because it's a mess. I mean, I get really down about it sometimes. Climate change and the drought in California, the economic disparities continue to grow, unarmed black men continue to be killed, women's rights and the rights of LGBT people and trans people, it seems like it's always under attack. And then you can look at the world news and see even more catastrophes happening all over the globe. People being massacred when they're just trying to go to school, things like that. And you think, wow, we're really not going to save the world. Like, it's just a mess. But we promised. We promised that we would do our best, that we'd live into these principles. We promised to affirm the dignity of every person. We promised to be just and equitable and compassionate, to follow our conscience and use the democratic process, to strive for that world peace with liberty and justice for everyone. So let's live into those promises as best we can, by acting as if we can do something to save the world. Let us lean into that mystery and wonder, however we access it. And with that faith, we'll act as if it matters what we do. Because at the end of the day, I really do believe that in all of our inadequacy, we are enough. And that together, those little drops, they really won't ever fill the bucket, but they're going to make a big splash. And when we act as if what we do matters, it really does matter.